Hello again. This is Mr. Pule, your friendly neighborhood instructor, and we're going to get started. And we're going to talk about confined spaces. Now, confined spaces are covered in 29 CFR 1910.146, permit required confined spaces. And that's a really, really involved standard. There's a heck of a lot to it. But a whole lot of the confusion occurs up front. In other words, in the very first part of the whole confined space issue is what are they? So, how to classify something as a confined space or a permit required confined space, and that's the only thing we're going to talk about here in this session is confined spaces and what makes a confined space and what makes permit required confined space. So let's start off with confined space because it's just a logical place to start. It's a space that has all three of these parameters. It's large enough and so configured that an employee can bodily enter and perform assigned work. It has limited means of entry and exit. It is not designed for continuous employee occupancy. Now we're going to talk about each one of those in a little more detail. Okay, this is the first one. It's large enough and so configured that an employee can bodily enter and perform work, assigned work. So that means you have to get your entire body into it. I've heard some people say, "Oh, if your hands get in it," no, that's if you put your head. Nope, that's not true. You have to be able to get your whole body in it and perform assigned work. So even if you were in there huddled up like this, just scrunched in there, you can't do anything. So that's not a confined space. It's got to be you got to be in there and perform assigned work. So that's one of the misconceptions that I've seen. Limited means of entry or exit. This one is probably the most open to discussion and confusing. Okay, this doesn't mean only one way in and one way out. Now, I've heard people say that. Well, it's only got one door. Okay, that's fine. If it's a regular personnel door, then that's fine. It's not a confined space. That doesn't make it a confined space. We'll talk about that a little bit later, about about that. But it means a person's ability to escape in an emergency would be hindered. That's the whole idea behind this. It's the thing is, if you're in this space and there's an emergency, are you going to be able to get out quickly? So if a person must twist, crawl, climb, pass through a narrow restraining opening, follow a lengthy path, or otherwise exert an effort to leave, then that's a limited means of entry or exit. Also, then there's some examples: portals, hatches, manhole openings, ladders, spiral stairways that are difficult to traverse, ship's ladders, or other steep stairways or crawl spaces. One of the examples I like is if you had a great big open pit that was just open to the top, nothing in it, and there was a ladder to get down into it. Would that be a confined space? Now it's an open pit with nothing above it. So it doesn't sound like a confined space. But guess what? It's because of the ladder, and that's the only way, only it's a obstructive means of entry and exit, a limited means of entry or exit. That makes it a confined space. So usually now a standard personnel door will make a space not a confined space. If usually that's the only way in or out, that usually is not a confined space. However, it still could be if access to that doorway is hindered. In other words, there may be a big room with only one door in it, and you think, well, it's a regular door. But if the work you're doing on is something is behind other stuff, or you have to climb through something else, or get to it, or like a walkway or something like a pathway, squeeze through something, then it could be a confined space. It's not the door making it the confined space. Then it's how you get to that door that makes it a confined space. But it's not designed for continuous human occupancy. This doesn't come up too often. Like sewer systems are considered confined spaces because they're huge, right? Sources, but they're not designed for continuous human occupancy. But a submarine, which is pretty tight and closed in, it is designed for continuous human occupancy. So it meets the other requirements for a confined space, except this one, because it is designed to be people in it all the time. So that's the three things. Now remember, once it's been established that the space fits all three of those parameters, it's considered a confined space. And here they are again: large enough and so configured that an employee can bodily enter and perform assigned work, limited means of entry or exit, and not designed for continuous human occupancy. So it has to meet all three of those requirements to be a confined space. Now that's just the first step, making it a confined space. Now let's assume that this particular space meets all three of these, so we are classifying it as a confined space. So if it doesn't meet all three of them, it's just a space. So let's see. So once it's been established that this is a confined space, it must now be determined if it's a permit required confined space. So a permit required confined space is also frequently referred to as a permit space or PRCS. But sometimes people just say confined spaces when they really mean permit required confined spaces. So you have to be clear that when you're talking to someone that they know what they're talking about. A permit required space is a confined space that meets any one of these four parameters. Now, any one of these. So it needs to be all three of the first three parameters to be a confined space. And if it is, now it has to only meet one of these. Contains or has the potential to contain a hazardous atmosphere. Contains a material that has the potential for engulfing an entrant. Has an internal configuration such that an entrant can be trapped or asphyxiated by inwardly converging walls or by a floor which slopes downward and tapers to a smaller cross section, or contains any other recognized serious or safety health hazard. Again, we're going to look at each one of these. First one, contains or has the potential to contain a hazardous atmosphere. Potential is a key word here. If it contains a hazardous atmosphere, you're probably not going to go in anyhow, right? So, but it has usually what gets you here is the potential. In other words, if this space, room, vat, whatever it is hooked up to some uh, other things that have hazardous atmospheres in them, even if it has like a valve on them, it still now has the potential to contain a hazardous atmosphere. The potential is the key word there. Contains a material that has the potential for engulfing an entrant. Most common of these is silos, but it can be sand or any flowing solid or liquid. It could be water even. And sadly, frequently on farms, because farms don't really fall under OSHA, and the families usually working in them since they're small. A lot of particularly young family members are killed in silos. They go in at the top, they try to walk it down. If it's bridging and that's not a good thing to do, and they get caught in a confined space, and that's got to be a terrible way to die. But people do it for some reason. They go in these with silo in them, silo with grain in them. Has an internal configuration such that an entrant could be trapped or asphyxiated by inwardly converging walls, something like this, or by a floor which slopes downward and tapers to a smaller cross section. So not real common, but it happens. Employees can get trapped, and you get trapped in this thing, you can't move, and you can be asphyxiated. Contains any other recognized serious safety or health hazard. Now, this is a typical OSHA catch-all, usually when they do this, there's a reason for it, but it's very important. It might be just an unguarded belt and pulley system. And so if it is something that's simple like that, if it can be locked out without entering the space, then it may be classified to a not just a regular confined space. If this is the only parameter that makes it a permit required confined space. So any other recognized serious safety or health hazard. So again, a space must meet all three of the confined space parameters to be classified as a confined space. And if it does, it only has to meet any one of the permit required confined spaces, the parameters, to become a permit required confined space or a permit space or a PRCS. So these concepts are unique to this standard and very misunderstood by most managers. So they'll look to you, the safety professional, to know them. So you ought to have a pretty good idea of what these confined space is, because this will come up in your work. So that's it. Be safe, everybody.